I am a 46-year-old man, and let me just say that what my son did recently has shaken me to the core. I have a boy, let's call him Jake, who is 23, and up until not too long ago, I'd have confidently described him as a genuinely good kid. To discover that he went ahead and took his late mother's cherished ring so he could give it to his girlfriend was absolutely infuriating, and saying, I was furious beyond measure, would be putting it lightly. It's like having a steel dagger slowly twisted between my shoulder blades. Just pure betrayal. I also have a daughter, whom I'll call Amber, and she's 16 years old. You see, Jake's behavior in all of this is so unexpected that I can barely fathom how it all started, especially given how dependable and decent I always believed him to be. Please remember to subscribe, like, and share this story to support my channel, because your encouragement really helps keep me going, and it'll allow me to keep sharing every detail of these wild events. I lost my wife nearly 2 years ago to a terrible illness. She was immunocompromised because of a condition she had been fighting for about a decade prior to her death. Thankfully, she had the foresight to have a will set up in case the worst happened, which, heartbreakingly, it did. In that will, she distributed her assets between our 2 children. Jake, who was already 21, inherited a decent share, enough to set up a down payment on a condo. He also got his late mother's car. Meanwhile, our daughter Amber was willed all of my wife's jewelry. That part of the inheritance happened to include an heirloom ring, a gorgeous vintage gold band with a diamond in the center, and 2 pale blue sapphires, one on each side. This was not some everyday accessory. This ring had been in my wife's family for generations. Originally, my wife's grandmother wore it as her wedding band, and her husband, a jeweler by trade, crafted it by hand. After that grandmother died, it passed on to my wife's mother, and then it came into my wife's possession when her own mother passed on. In other words, there was an extremely meaningful lineage attached to it. It is now Amber's rightful keepsake. As per the will, in the wake of losing my wife, grief almost tore me to pieces. Still, I had to stay strong for my 2 kids, and thankfully they stood by me through the worst times. When Jake took that ring, it felt like an unimaginable breach of trust, like a deep puncture wound to my soul. For the last 8 months, Jake had been dating a woman named Sarah, not her real name. This young lady adores jewelry. She piles on multiple pieces, from bracelets to necklaces, every time I see her. Jake mentioned the jewelry my wife had left for Amber, and apparently Sarah got super excited and wanted to see the whole collection. So, while no one was home, Jake thought it was a perfectly fine idea to walk right into my bedroom, open up the place where all the jewelry was stored, and show Sarah everything, without my knowledge or permission. Later, Jake confessed to me that he had done this. I was outraged, but I initially assumed that was the end of it. He'd messed up and wouldn't do something like that again. Oh, how wrong I was. Just a week ago, Jake came to me almost trembling with excitement. He wanted to propose to Sarah, and he was dead set on using that very ring, the ring that was now Amber's property. He told me Sarah had fallen head over heels in love with it when she'd gotten a peek previously, and he felt it was the perfect ring to pop the big question. He spoke as though I was supposed to be overjoyed and would hand it over immediately. However, I made it perfectly clear that it wasn't mine to give. It belonged to Amber, and if she didn't want to part with it, then that was final. But I tried to be fair, so I told Jake I would allow him to make his case and ask Amber for the ring, but only once. No repeated pleading or harassment. And if Amber said no, for whatever reason, that would be the end of the conversation. Jake agreed to these conditions and brought up the proposal right in front of me, asking Amber for the ring. Amber, though, wouldn't have it at all. She absolutely loved that ring and did not want it going anywhere. To her, it was simply irreplaceable, a link to her mother and the generations of women who wore it before. I backed Amber up, telling Jake he was not to push the issue and that he should let it go. If he really wanted something similar, he could search around, possibly even have something else custom made. He left with a face that looked both dejected and furious, but I genuinely believed that was the end of it. I soon discovered that wasn't the case. Another day, while I was at work, Jake decided to come back to my house. Amber was home from school, and he tried to press her yet again about the ring. An argument erupted. Amber called me on the phone, crying because Jake was putting so much pressure on her. I immediately called Jake, told him to get out of my house, and to leave his sister alone. He got mad at me, protesting that he had just as much right to the ring, since my wife was his mother too. I pointed out that he had already received other valuable things from his mother's estate, money and her car. The jewelry, specifically the ring, was left entirely to Amber. End of story. He hung up, infuriated, and my daughter texted me soon after to say Jake had stormed away in a rage. But that wasn't the end of this disastrous scenario. Just before I was about to clock out at work, Amber frantically called me again, sobbing. She said Jake had come back yet another time, dressed nicely in a suit, marched into my bedroom, taken something, and then left without a word. She tried to stop him, but he shoved her aside. I wasted no time getting home, and sure enough, the moment I opened my wife's jewelry box, I saw that the precious ring was gone. It didn't take a detective to figure out who snatched it. I dialed Jake's phone repeatedly, but he wouldn't pick up. I had no choice but to text him, warning that if he didn't return the ring at once, I would report him to the authorities without hesitation, engagement or not. Only then did he reply. He tried to guilt-trip me by pointing out that he's my son, and I shouldn't do this to him. I shot back that he had committed theft, plain and simple, and that he had better bring back the ring immediately. He called me, speaking in a tense, hushed tone, and said it was too late. He had already proposed to Sarah at dinner. So this ring had been gone from the house for maybe just over an hour, and it was already on her finger. I told him tough luck. Stolen property is stolen property. He needed to return it immediately or face the legal fallout. I even said I'd contact an attorney if push came to shove. He began to cry, claiming I was blowing up his life. I reminded him that he had betrayed his mother and sister by stealing it, and that I was utterly unyielding on this matter. Finally, he said he'd come by in the morning, obviously still tearful, and hung up. The next morning, Jake did turn up, but he didn't come alone. Sarah was with him, and I could see how determined she was to keep that ring through some sort of emotional manipulation. She already knew she was wearing a stolen item, but she gave off this vibe of entitlement, as if that ring was hers by sheer force of wanting it. I basically told her that I didn't care how much she loved it. That ring was my daughter's inheritance from her deceased mother. She could either hire a professional jeweler to create a replica or find something similar, but the ring that once belonged to multiple generations in my wife's family was entirely off limits to her. Jake actually pleaded with me yet again, but Amber and I were a united front. Sarah had to remove the ring from her finger or we take legal action. Sarah pulled the ring from her hand and dropped it into Amber's palm, cussing me out by calling me something along the lines of a wicked jerk, only with harsher wording. Then she bolted out, crying. Jake turned red in the face, screaming that I'd ruined his relationship. I didn't hold back. I told him that he himself had jeopardized it by stealing something so priceless from his own mother's memory and from his own sister. What kind of decent son steals from his family like that? He had no comeback for that. He stomped out after Sarah. I tried to keep the matter quiet, but Jake decided to share it with other relatives and friends in an attempt to gain supporters. It backfired on him. Everyone he told, our family, extended relatives, friends, sided with me and Amber. They all recognized the ring belonged to Amber, and that his actions were inexcusable. People kept reaching out, saying how sorry they were that I had to deal with this. And the negativity directed at him made it even worse. The story spread, and many folks offered condolences and reassured me I was in the right. In the following days, Jake refused to speak to me. I tried to reconcile by sending him thorough photos of the ring, explaining that if he truly wanted one so similar for Sarah, he could have a jeweler replicate it. However, genuine duplication of that ring would cost a fortune, especially if he wanted authentic stones. Cheaper imitation stones might be his only financially viable route, but I never heard back from him. As for what's going on with Jake and Sarah, I couldn't say. I just know that I took every piece of my wife's jewelry and put it into a secure safety deposit box under my name, with only my access allowed, until my daughter is older, 21 at the very least. She can even choose to keep it there even longer if she wants. I'm not budging on that. Morally, I feel entirely justified in retrieving the ring. The painful part is that I don't want this fiasco to create a permanent rift between me and my son, nor do I want the entire family to keep viewing him as some sort of villain. But I genuinely don't know how else to handle this, aside from refusing to just hand over the ring. If anyone has a clue about how to calm the waters without me having to fork over the ring or shell out massive amounts of money, I'm open to suggestions. Time for an update. Jake's girlfriend Sarah has now officially broken up with him, and he's placing all the blame squarely on my shoulders. People have said I was giving him too much credit by repeatedly calling him a good kid. Maybe that was accurate years ago, but lately, he's turned into someone I can hardly recognize. I don't know if he was always harboring this attitude deep within, or if Sarah was just a negative influence on him, but none of that excuses the actions he took. After I forced the return of the stolen ring, Sarah basically spent days sobbing and wailing. Apparently, Jake told me she didn't want any other ring, no matter how nice it was or how much it cost. She wanted that ring, the ring that used to belong to my dead wife, and should rightly go to my daughter. Sarah said she couldn't even picture herself wearing something else after she'd had it on her finger, even for just a few hours, and even if it was stolen. That kind of melodramatic crying reminds me of a child crying over a taken toy more than a grown woman. Various folks even pointed out that this was unbelievably childish, but the entire fiasco was far from hush-hush at this point, because Jake had ranted to the entire family, including Sarah's circle of friends, in an attempt to rally them behind him. That only fueled more drama. In the meantime, I've had random people messaging me with information. Although I didn't go looking for details, the local rumor mill wouldn't leave me alone. Several said that Jake took those photos of the ring, the ones I originally provided, straight to a jeweler, seeking a quote for a custom duplicate. That jeweler advised that to make a ring truly identical, the original piece would need close examination to measure everything precisely and evaluate the stones, the gold, the platinum, etc. Because it's quite an old piece, you'd need to replicate every angle down to the floral designs carved into the band. He waited a while before swallowing his pride and contacting me again. By then, Sarah had apparently caved slightly, willing to settle for a well-crafted replica if it was precise enough. So Jake called me a few days after this whole stolen ring episode, asked if I'd go with them to a jeweler so they could check the ring's specs. I promised to take an extended lunch break that day, fetch the ring from the safety deposit box, and meet them at a local jewelry store. The moment I got there and pulled out the ring, which I guarded like a hawk, Sarah's eyes practically sparkled with longing and greed. I mean, she literally stuck her hand out, silently asking me to let her wear it again. Just once more, she said. I refused, and that turned her expression into a petulant pout, as if she were a spoiled kid denied a treat at the candy store. The jeweler then examined the ring carefully, praising its high craftsmanship. It was made sometime in the 1940s by my wife's grandfather, so it was old but well preserved. He noted that it featured a pretty thick band of likely 18-karat gold with platinum components holding the precious stones. The diamond and sapphires were of a respectable size for an engagement ring, and the ring also had that elaborate floral motif. That's all expensive to replicate 100%. Big labor costs, pricey materials, time-consuming detail work. According to the jeweler, it would cost about 5 times the amount Jake had in savings. He'd have to finance it and pay it off over years. The jeweler even offered more budget-friendly approaches, like substituting cheaper metals for platinum or using stones that looked diamond-like rather than genuine diamonds. He also said they might find a modern ring that looks pretty close and buy it for a fraction of the cost. Jake seemed willing to consider these alternatives, but Sarah smacked him in the face, calling him a broke poser or something equally insulting, then turned her fury back on me, calling me a hateful jerk, though her exact language was far more vulgar, for daring to take that original ring away from her. In her view, once Jake had placed it on her finger, it was rightfully hers. She also tried to argue that Amber wouldn't really use it anyway, because she's a woman and a man would simply buy her a ring if she got engaged someday. I have never been so tempted to scream at someone in my life. I felt the anger rising in me, and it must have shown on my face because Sarah actually stepped backward. I told her in no uncertain terms that she would never have that ring, period. It was never Jake's to give. He had sneaked into my home while I was absent, literally stolen it, so her wearing it was illegitimate from the start. She was acting like an entitled, demanding individual who believed that wanting something badly enough automatically made it hers. And I pointed out that she had been drooling over the ring from the moment she first set eyes on it, not caring that it was supposed to go to my daughter after my wife's passing. I admit I ranted on, probably a bit long-winded. My wife had once told me I have a special gift for pinpointing people's weaknesses with words, and that day, I proved her right. Sarah looked like she wanted to smack me across the face too, but she hesitated, realized it might not go well, and instead stormed off, shrieking in some barely comprehensible rage that pounded my eardrums. On her way out, she knocked down a small display on purpose. Jake glared at me like he wished I would vanish into thin air. I asked him point blank how he could remain with a woman who showed such appalling character, but all he said was he loved her, and then he left after her. She is very physically attractive, sure, but that's a superficial quality if the rest of her personality is so dreadful. Well, not long after that, Jake reached out to Sarah, tried to placate her, offered to get her a different ring. She apparently locked herself away, sobbing dramatically, and ended up telling him that if she couldn't have my wife's family heirloom, she'd rather not have anything. She even told him that seeing a second-rate ring on her finger would only remind her of what could have been. So they kept fighting about it. Sarah declared she was through with him because he wasn't providing her the ring she deserved, and she couldn't tolerate me as a father-in-law, calling me a penny-pinching old man. Now, a lot of people started labeling her a gold digger. Her response was basically to claim she was the victim, and that I humiliated her. But come on, she slapped my son just because he considered cheaper ways to replicate an extravagant ring. That is exactly the definition of a shallow, money-hungry person. She would have bounced any wealthy guy who crossed her path and offered her bigger luxuries, in my opinion. Then, something happened that I truly didn't see coming. Jake tried to re-enter my home, again, while I was away. My guess is that he might have assumed the jewelry collection was still there, or maybe he was aiming for some emergency money I keep in a secured safe. I hate to suspect that of my own child, but once someone steals from you once, you're forced to consider that they might do it again. He no longer had a valid key though, because I had changed the locks. Someone on the internet had suggested that, and it seemed wise. My daughter called me, trembling and terrified, because Jake was banging on the door, shouting to be let in. The moment his phone started ringing with my unique ringtone, he left in a hurry. By the time I spoke to him, he was raging at me for not trusting him. I told him he'd lost my trust the instant he stole that ring. Jake tried to deflect blame onto me again, claiming his mother, if she were alive, would have wanted him to have that ring for his proposal. That made me see red. I shot back that if she had truly wished that, she could have written it into her will. But she didn't. She specifically left the jewelry to Amber. That was the final straw. Jake's meltdown continued. He started ranting about how Sarah said I was stingy and controlling. I pointed out that he was basically putting words in my mouth. I had never openly disapproved of Sarah in the past. In fact, I hardly knew her at all. We barely interacted. But this was no longer about whether I liked Sarah or not. This was about him violating his sister's rights to an heirloom. He refused to say what he wanted in the house when he was pounding on my door, so I answered for him. If he was planning on grabbing the ring or any of the other family pieces, tough luck. They had been moved to a safety deposit box. If he was after my emergency cash, he wouldn't be able to open my safe. And if he intended any harm toward his sister, I was prepared to protect her personally. The phone line went dead silent. Finally, he said he had decided to apply for a job transfer, put his condo up for sale, and relocate somewhere far away. He told me to enjoy the rest of my life with my favorite child, then hung up. I'm still shell-shocked by how quickly my own son became this unrecognizable person. Whether Sarah molded him into this, or he always had this in him, I can't say. But how could he commit outright theft from his mother's estate to please a new girlfriend he'd been dating for only 8 months? It's terrifying to imagine them actually married. Now, if there is any bright spot in this, it's that I'm relieved they did not end up engaged for real. That woman's meltdown over not getting a stolen ring was beyond reason. Even so, I never expected the repercussions to be this severe. We're still basically estranged, with Jake refusing to listen to reason and trying to make me the scapegoat for all his problems. Meanwhile, Amber, my daughter, was also deeply shaken. She's thankful I fought to get the ring back, but is horrified at her brother's physical aggression. He shoved her and stole the ring. She has called him an oaf, and also an S. I'm not fully sure what that means in teen slang. She's grateful for all the extended family who have rallied around her. Jake doesn't really have that support system because nobody else defends his actions. Even his lifelong best friend cut ties with him after telling him how he was in the wrong. Jake responded by effectively ending that friendship. Sarah, in turn, got in trouble with her own parents. They reached out to me, apologizing for her awful behavior. They were horrified by how she'd apparently demanded a stolen heirloom from a grieving widow's family. They also clarified that, up until a few years ago, Sarah had been much nicer, but she had changed drastically, and they weren't sure why. To top it off, her parents had been paying a portion of her rent, but after learning what happened, they told her they wouldn't continue, that once her current lease was over, she'd have to handle everything on her own or find cheaper living arrangements. She then started cursing my name publicly, claiming it was all my fault. Honestly, it's as if some people in this world feel entitled to anything they want, and if they don't get it, they fling insults at everyone around them. I'm worn out from the constant drama, but I stand by my decision to keep that ring with Amber. And I can only hope that one day, Jake will come around and realize the damage he caused. I miss the person he used to be, but I can't let him or anyone else walk all over my daughter and take something that belonged to my wife's memory. If he can't accept that, I suppose we'll remain at an impasse. Then another update came to light. My son did try to get back with Sarah, but apparently, she broke things off entirely. She called it quits and stuck to it. Jake is blaming me for the end of the relationship, saying I ruined everything by blowing up about the stolen ring. Everyone else keeps telling him that he's the architect of his own demise. The story of him taking the ring spread like wildfire around family, friends, and neighbors. I've been receiving so many phone calls, messages, and visits from acquaintances I barely know, all to express their shock and dismay at Jake's antics. I never asked for such publicity, but that's the reality. One day, I was told Jake had shown pictures of the ring to a jeweler, who explained how expensive a true replication would be. It seemed feasible only if he used substitute materials. Sarah refused, stating she wanted the real deal or nothing at all. Jake, in a moment of frustration, told her they could get a ring made of alternative metals and use stones that resembled diamonds, but she slapped him and spit out insults. She even left the shop in a tantrum. That meltdown was the last straw for a lot of the people who heard about it, which is practically everyone. She humiliated Jake by labeling him inadequate. Afterwards, Sarah decided that she was entirely done with Jake. She declared that he didn't value her enough and that she was mortified by me, calling me cruel for taking back something she had already been given. She implied that I should have just mindlessly handed over the ring. Once it was on her finger. Now, she's facing a wave of judgment from people who think she's a shameless gold digger. She's livid about that label, but the facts speak for themselves. She essentially had a tantrum over not getting a ring she knew wasn't rightfully hers. On top of that, Jake seemingly tried to get inside my house once more, presumably to steal the ring or something else valuable. Again, I can't say for certain, but it's a disturbing possibility. Luckily, I had already changed the locks. My daughter called me in tears because Jake was hammering on the door, demanding entry. When I called his phone, he sped off. Later, when I spoke to him, he tried to twist everything, insisting I'm the one who messed up by not letting him propose with the ring. He keeps harping on the idea that his mother would have wanted him to have it. And I keep repeating that if that were true, she would have put that in her will. She didn't. She specifically said the jewelry was Amber's. That's the final word. He ended up raging at me, calling me unprintable names, and refusing to own up to the fact that it was his misguided decision. I'm exhausted and furious. I just want him to see reason, but he's chosen to blame me, claiming Sarah was the puppet master all along, or that I'm the penny-pinching father who never let him do anything. He's even losing old friends after trying to turn them against me. They too see he's at fault. Meanwhile, Sarah's parents told me they're dropping financial support for her apartment. Not long after that, Sarah tried to publicly shame me in a local shopping mall, literally yelling at me in front of people and calling me a stingy old man. My friend, who was with me at the time, quickly reminded her that she was the one who wanted stolen property, hardly a moral high ground. She got so upset by that remark she started knocking things over, including accidentally pushing down a little kid. She then ran away. It was appalling behavior. She later came to my house and screeched at me for ruining her friendships. People have dropped her, calling her manipulative and gold-obsessed. She tried to blame me for everything, so I told her she was indeed acting the gold digger. She ran off after more ear-splitting shrieks. I've been asked by a few if maybe drugs were at play here, but her parents told me she took a test when she got arrested, because yes, she was arrested for damaging property while trying to break into my house with an axe, and her system was completely clear of illegal substances. She was simply unbalanced, psychologically speaking. After the break-in fiasco, the police found her at her apartment, and she apparently went berserk on them, biting and threatening them. Her parents apologized to me, offering to pay for the damage to my door, and said they would move her out of town once they settled legal matters. So, that part is hopefully over, but it leaves me with the heartbreak that my son was deeply involved with her in the first place, going so far as to commit theft on her behalf. I can't absolve Jake for his choices, but I do suspect she made him even worse. In any case, the ring and all my wife's jewelry are no longer in the house. They're locked up in that deposit box. Meanwhile, Jake is continuing to badmouth me, now putting blame on Sarah as well, labeling her that deranged gold digger. According to a coworker of his who reached out, Jake is angry the ring fiasco cost him his happiness. He refuses to see that he alone caused this downfall. He wanted to placate Sarah, thought the ring was a perfect solution to that end, but ended up a thief. Until he learns to take responsibility, we can't have a healthy relationship. I hope he finds his way someday. In the meantime, I'm done letting this wreck me emotionally. I still love him as my son, but I won't let him terrorize my daughter or rummage through our family heirlooms. That's where matters stand. Unless something else catastrophic happens, this should be my final update, so hopefully life settles back down. A quick extra note. There have been trolls bombarding me with hateful personal messages, calling me a terrible father or even psychotic. They don't offer any constructive feedback, just pointless name-calling. If you have a negative opinion of me, at least suggest a practical way I could have handled this better. My son literally stole the ring and assaulted my daughter. Should I have just let him keep it? That's absurd. And for people who claim I favor my daughter, that's not true. Jake got over $50,000 from his mother's estate, plus her car, while Amber got the family jewelry. That's fair distribution. I also covered Jake's college costs, just as I will do for Amber. I did not blow things out of proportion. Jake and Sarah did that themselves. After everything they've done, I only took the sensible step of changing my locks and removing valuables from my house. That's not an overreaction. That's basic security and peace of mind. So anyone who's calling me a tyrant or a psycho might want to recheck the actual facts of what occurred. Final big piece of news. Jake has now sold his condo and left town entirely. I heard the last few weeks have been miserable for him. Everyone in the neighborhood knew about his theft, and one time a local confronted him in a bar, calling him out in front of a group of patrons. I took one last shot at reconciling when I heard he was packing up. I went to his condo and knocked on the door, hoping we could talk about everything face to face, maybe get closure or even salvage our relationship. But he wouldn't open the door. He told me through the barrier that I was the one who ruined his life, and that this ring fiasco has destroyed him. He claimed his mother would have agreed with him. I reminded him that if that were the case, his mother would have put it explicitly in her will. She didn't. She wanted the jewelry to go to Amber. He wouldn't acknowledge it. Then he started ranting about how I should have let Sarah keep it, or at least paid to have it copied. But Sarah ended up showing her true colors anyway, so that had nothing to do with me. I pointed out that he had physically shoved his little sister aside and taken something he had no right to. Everyone is against his actions because they're plainly indefensible. I heard him crying and banging on something inside the condo. A neighbor down the hall peeked out of her door, then quickly ducked back in, probably to avoid the confrontation. A few minutes later, a squad car pulled up, and 2 officers got out. Apparently Jake had called them, telling them I was trying to break in. I explained politely that I'd only been standing outside, knocking and talking, never forcing my way in. One officer cuffed me, apologizing and saying they had to confirm the facts. The other officer went inside to speak with neighbors and check the building's security cameras, which recorded the hallway. Eventually, they confirmed my version of events, that I hadn't attempted to break in at all, so they removed the cuffs. They also recognized me from the widely circulated story of the stolen ring and Sarah's rampage. One of them mentioned he had been there when Sarah got arrested, that she was biting and threatening them with vile language. They told me to just head home, and that I'd probably be better off leaving Jake alone, given the tension. I did exactly that. Later, the neighbor told me that the officers gave Jake a sharp scolding for misusing emergency services. That was basically the last interaction I had with my son before he left. He texted me at some point, saying something about, "Have a nice life with your favorite child." Then he promptly sold his condo and moved away. Maybe in time he'll process what happened. I told him I'd always love him and keep my door open for him if he ever wants to come back, but I can't support theft and assault. Amber has been incredibly supportive through all this, even as she deals with her own heartbreak over losing the brother she once admired. We're planning to spend Christmas without him now, for the first time in over 2 decades. We'll also miss my wife terribly, but at least we have each other and the rest of my wife's large extended family, who have been offering unending support. By the way, some have asked about the size of my city. It's not super tiny, but smaller than average, and my late wife came from a huge extended family that spread all around town. When Jake and Sarah tried to spin the story their own way, the rumor mill lit up like fireworks, and word circulated at an incredible rate. That's why everyone seemed to know so many details. I attempted damage control, repeatedly urging folks to pull down their social media posts, but once the cat was out of the bag, there was no shoving it back in. In the end, I'm just an older dad who loves some classic video games and tries to be there for both of my children. I never foresaw these events. My only hope is that one day Jake will come to his senses, take responsibility for his actions, and realize that I was never out to get him, just to protect what belonged to Amber. The ring and the rest of the heirloom jewelry remain securely locked away, waiting for the day she's older or feels comfortable keeping them in a home safe. If you've stuck with me through all these updates, I appreciate you. This has been an exhausting journey, full of heartbreak and unexpected twists, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. But now, I have to accept that Jake is gone from our everyday lives. Maybe time will allow him to heal and change. As for Sarah, last I heard, she's dealing with her own legal issues, parental disappointment, and mental health struggles. That's all out of my hands. Yes, I did receive an additional anonymous message claiming Sarah was wealthy, and that Jake was after her family's money, making him a kind of gold digger too. I can't confirm or deny that. My daughter says she believes it, based on how Jake suddenly got so obsessed with providing Sarah some flashy engagement ring. If it's true, I guess they were using each other. Sarah for the heirloom ring that signaled a grand entrance back to her parents' good graces, and Jake for the possibility of in-laws with deep pockets. It's still devastating to think he'd stoop to that. Whatever the real story is, this entire chain of events left me battered and uncertain how or if my son and I will ever reconcile. For now, though, I have to move forward, hoping for more peaceful times for me and Amber. That's where it stands. Please show your support by subscribing, liking, and sharing this story, because every bit of engagement helps me continue sharing these experiences in thorough detail. I wish everyone a calmer and happier future than the one my family has faced recently.